You gotta love the robotic voice.
Indeed. Nikita Mikhailov. We're not talking robots. We're talking personalities, real people, albeit helped by some digital technologies. In your own words, Nikita, who are you?
Well, human being, Chief Neuroticism Officer, and I've been working in the world of personality for over 12 years now. And to me, what's most interesting is how we can work with people to make them maybe a couple of percent more curious about themselves and others, and a couple of percent less judgmental.
Hmm. Interesting. So you're based in England. Tell us a little
hmm
bit about your background.
So I grew up in the town in Soviet Union in my earliest childhood. It was a scientific town, so we had neurodiversity before it was cool. And then at a young age, I moved to a lovely place called Yorkshire when I spoke two words in English. I don't speak English, and come on, baby, light my fire because my brothers listen to Doors and my parents sent me to school. So that experience made me interested in, let's say, cultural differences in psychology. Then I pursued this at university, and then I just ended up working in personality. I can post rationalize my journey, but I would say 80% was chance. But I'm quite happy how it worked out.
So how did you end up in Yorkshire? What was the route that your parents took to go to up north?
Well, I was born originally in Siberia, so north is relative.
That's true.
Um, so my dad, he's a professor of applied mathematics and physics. He had three job offers: US, south of France, and Yorkshire. So he didn't fancy working in the US too much at that stage. That south of France life is too good, he'll never get any work done. So he picked Yorkshire as a middle ground between US and south of France. So we could have been in Nice instead of Leeds, but to him it was a good idea at the time.
Well, it certainly speaks to his must have been his prowess to have had three offers from those three places. And so let's dig in on your book here, Personality, which you co-wrote with Georgi Yankov.
hmm
Why this book, Personality, a User's Guide?
Well, I think that personality is a fascinating topic because if we listen to everyday communication and conversations, personality is a word like psychology, which gets used a lot. And I don't know which one actually gets used more, psychology or personality in everyday language. You hear it all the time, like, my boss has a strong personality, or I married them for their personality, or I bought this chair because it has character, or my dog has a playful personality. So we use this all the time. And at the same time, we have these two lines. One is everyday use, such as when you pick up a newspaper, there's always a zodiac there. So to me, zodiac is the first personality assessment. You're asked one question: when are you born? And then you get 12 types, such as Leo, which is clearly the best because it's mine, but which
And
gives you a
mine, by
little.
the way.
Oh, perfect. Then excellent. We can agree it's the best.
Of
But
course.
so it's the key thing here is that with star signs, it's about, first of all, what is in it for me? Such as you shall meet a tall, dark stranger on Saturday. But what's really cool there is that the second step, people immediately go, how do I relate to somebody else? Like, how do I relate to a Virgo or what have you? Because this fundamental thing about self narrative and models and how we see ourselves and how we see others is intrinsic, I think, to our being. And Zodiac is just one model of that. And then, but things have moved on in thousands of years. And now we have the field of psychometrics and personality psychology, which does all sorts of research with brain scans, genetics, what are we drawn to, how people behave in different situations based on their personality. But that field made something amazing. They took this thing which people are interested in every day. To that extent, it's in every newspaper. And they made it so boring, so convoluted, and understandable that people can't access all that goodness of knowledge. So Georgi and I thought that why not we take all of that lovely personality psychology and all that research that has been done over the years and make it usable and valuable and most importantly understandable to as many people as we can, because we all have a personality. So based on personality psychology, we decided to write a user's guide for it.
Beautiful. So with Georgi, I've co-written a book. I'd love for you to just to talk us through the experience of writing a book with four hands, two minds.
Well, there's also the editors. So
Of
that's
course.
like eight, four heads and eight hands. But with Georgi, how we met is that I have a policy. Anybody who I argue with on LinkedIn and social media, I have a call with. And I met Georgi through an argument because when you argue with somebody on a professional topic, you both feel strongly about the topic and hand, hence you're arguing, but you have a different perspective. And I find that social media does allow you to smash your keyboard and stuff like that and feel righteous. But it's far more interesting to have a call with this person.
And have a face-to-face conversation in like the good old days.
Yeah, Google Base you mentioned.
No, a face-to-face conversation.
Oh, completely, if possible. So Georgi is based in the States. So next time I was in the States, we met as well. Because it is so important to actually have these conversations. And we just got on. But I'm more of a practitioner. So over 12 years, I deliver more. I work with psychometrics. So I do one-to-one sessions. I do coaching. I do group workshops. While Georgi, his background is actually philosophy originally. And then he went into big data. So he designed psychometric assessments and all the data analytics, all the stuff I can't understand because all that mathematical side from my dad, it clearly skipped the generation in my case. So to me, it's just like, I can sort of get it, but if it looks legit, I'm happy to go along with it. And so we kind of bring complementary sides. And the way we decided to write this book, it was quite random. It was just a conversation because I thought before you need to submit a whole book and then you get a book deal and all this stuff. But we were just chatting and it's like, do we know an agent? And we know a friend of us who publishes a lot. So I wrote him a LinkedIn message. He immediately connected with the agent. We had a chat. He just submitted us a chapter and one-page business analysis. We did that. Said good enough, though it's two chapters, not one. You submitted, and we got the book deal. So we started writing, and the way we kind of separated our areas of expertise. So I was the practical, and he was the philosophical. And the way we created this book is that you just need to read the first chapter, which is the Rosetta Stone. So it gives you an introduction to personality theory, a few different models, and then you can pick whatever chapter you want, be it leadership, personality and context, personality and AI, whichever floats your boat, and you can read them separately. And you can notice that the writing style is quite different between us. Of course, we went through each other's work later and slightly edited, so it wasn't completely different like apple and oranges or chalk and cheese, but we still wanted to preserve that this is two authors, not one.
Yeah, makes sense. Brilliant. Well, that's really interesting. I think it is such a challenging experience to co-write, especially when it's a first time. You've never really got a history before you, but the complementarity of your skills is really interesting. Let's start with talking about AI, but more social media and what role do you observe social media has had on our personalities? Do you feel like it's that way on us, or it's us through social media?
I think it's a fascinating question, and maybe it's even too soon to tell because it's being so prevalent right now. I think with personality exists in context, and one of the contexts is other people. Like when you say, I'm more extroverted, compared to whom? Or I'm more neurotic, compared to whom? Because usually you'd compare yourself to, 10, 20 people, and in real world behavior. Now with social media, you're potentially comparing yourselves to hundreds of people and you're not comparing them to how you see them. The image is much more curated by them. It's how they want to appear. So, you often see posts of people who are having time of their lives, extroverted, high agreeableness, doing nice things, humble bragging, all of this. And, but that's not necessarily them. And then I think it's a whole new field that now we're comparing our personalities and who we are, not to actual people, but digital avatars. And I'm not sure what the psychological impact of that will be.
Well, that is certainly a topic near to my heart, and the subject of hopefully my new book. So that's interesting that you express it that way. The idea of comparing with your real self, presentation of yourself, as opposed to comparing yourself to others. And it brings up for me another question, which is your psychometrics, which you study. To what extent these psychometrics are deeply cultural, as in what is humility in South Korea or Japan might be very differently understood or represented versus an American sense of humble pie.
Absolutely. So psychometrics is basically a measurement of a psychological construct. That's what it means. Psychometric. And one of the things that psychometric constructs that is called personality. First of all, what's really interesting, nobody can agree what personality is. So you can read lots of definitions, but they're all quite different. But to me, the way I break it down, it comes down, it's like a layered cake. There's what you like, there's what you do, there's what you do too much, and what you aspire to be. So there's kind of multiple layers. If you ask in America, a survey, 80% in the recent study said they want to change their personality. And they want to be less neurotic, so more emotionally stable, and more extroverted. So more kind of positive and all of that. Like the world needs more extroverts. Oh my God. But the key thing is that there's many layers to personality. And people don't really agree what it is, but I think this is a testament to how fluid personality is. So, and if people say, your personality is fixed, well, surely if it was fixed, we'd be able to define it better. Maybe the fact we're so fluid actually speaks to the dynamics of this entity we call personality. Because though there's literally, if you go to Google Scholar, type in personality research, you'll get millions of hits. But we still can't define it. So to me, what's really interesting here is that at the same time, we do all this research on it, but we can't define it. And that's what makes it really kind of interesting. It's like order and chaos. So when we come to psychometrics, we're creating tools we try to define it, but we can't clearly define it. By the way, public service announcement, how can you tell that an article about psychology is likely to be rubbish? It starts with the following words: psychologists agree. Psychologists don't agree on anything, really. Probably not even that the psychologists disagree. Anyways, but the key thing here, when we come to design of psychometrics, there it's usually a couple of researchers, they want to study a particular thing. Let's say how personality changes over time. And they can't find assessments that really kind of suit their boat. So they write questions about the personality, like, I feel energized by interacting with lots of new people, measuring extroversion, or I'm anxious by nature. So they create all these items to measure personalities, they do factor analysis to see that it sticks together, all that stuff, that it's reliable, valid. And then they do this research on this. But there's a couple of things to watch out for. So cultural, absolutely, where is it designed? If you build it with 100 students in US in 1950s, it's sort of stuck in that time to an extent. Like, for example, even the language. So I was involved in update of a psychometric assessment, and one of the items was, I'm lackadaisical by nature. I love the word lackadaisical. To me, lackadaisical is one of the best words in English. It's just right there next to shenanigans. But you need to update even the language of the questionnaires. So the British Psychological Society says you need to update the language every 10 years. So to keep up with the times. Second, there's another issue, is the cultural one. So let's say, with measure extroversion saying, I like to go out and socialize in bars. I feel energized by this. But what if you send it to a country where there is no bars? Then you're not measuring that extroversion. You're measuring a cultural thing. So another key issue is translation. So if you need to translate even the items to the other territory, it becomes problematic. So my mentor was translating the questionnaires at one point into French. And there was one item, I'm not afraid of hard work. and they sent it to French office workers. So they translated it, sent it, and all the French workers disagreed. And they were like, look at the French. They're all afraid of hard work, until they gave it to a French native speaker. And it's like, what's going on? It says, you translated hard work with words which we associate with hard manual farm labor. And you sent it to office workers. So, of course, they disagree with this because they're not doing hard farm labor. So even things like this play a part. So when psychometrics are translated, updated, it's very important. And they're also a bit like time capsules, because a lot of psychometrics are built in the 40s, which are still used now, and 50s, 60s, 70s. So what was its relevant and cultural norms is also key. And I also say that most psychometrics, because they're all written by people, we try to be objective, we do our best, but they're still subjective. They're still biased. It's all written by humans. And most psychometric models will tell you more about the personality of the author than it does about your client, because it's how they see personality. But you should not take them too seriously. It's just a model, because ultimately what we're working with here is a self-narrative. We all tell a story about how we see ourselves and who am I, and who I am not. Because when people tell us stuff, like when my wife goes, Nick, you're being argumentative, I go, no, I'm not, because I think I'm being logical. We do have this story we've been telling ourselves for a long, long time. And what a psychometric does is tries to assess this story by asking you all those lots of hundreds of questions. But it's not you. It's a viewpoint on you. It's like I always say, in a group of 12 people, there's 12 versions of you. So there's one how you see yourself, and there's 11 how other people interpret your behavior and make assumptions on who you are. And the psychometric is just another viewpoint, because quite often people put a psychometric ahead of the person, and that's where it becomes an issue. And quite often people do this. It's like, oh, this is you. No, it's not. It's just a viewpoint. It's biased. It's subjective. Tells you more about the author, but it can still be very, very useful. It's like a lot of people bash MBTI right now, but MBTI can be highly useful if people, because let's look at the honest investment. You spend 20 minutes doing the assessment. You spend an hour coaching session. Maybe you did like half a day or in a day, team day. So like 1.5 days investment, right? And if a person who's highly extroverted realize introverts don't reject their ideas just because they're not as excited outwardly as they are. And an introvert realizes that extroverts are not that psychic. So if you don't voice their ideas, they're not necessarily going to ask you. That's a huge takeaways that make life a little bit easier based on that miniature investment of time. And anyways, usually your L&D department will pay for it. So to me, it's more about what I call utilitarian validity. It's how useful the assessment is to the person.
Yeah, that's fascinating. One small comment in all of that: language changing every 10 years by the British guardians of language. It feels like maybe you need to do it even quicker these days. Like everything is going a little bit quicker, where, in 2014, gender dysphoria wasn't quite a topic. It's, very much a topic, and it's going to continue in terms of fluidity. What are the things that, so the interesting idea here is that personalities can evolve. As you write many times, the notion is your experiences form your personality. So if you have a big experience, that can somehow make you evolve. What's the link between values and personality?
Well, that's a very interesting one, because values can be also quite cultural. So what we know about personality change, it happens by itself. Sometimes you don't even need those large experiences to change your personality. It's like we know, like from 18 to 30, people tend to become less neurotic, more emotionally stable, a bit less extroverted, more agreeable, and more conscientious. But one of the arguments for it is that your life becomes more of a pattern, such as, paying the mortgage, having a job, 9 to 5, like Dolly Parton sings. And because of this, you become more conscientious, because it's just more of a pattern. But so there's lots of arguments there. I think that values are more about what you're guided by. And with personalities, there could be a good connection, especially if you have strong preferences. So if you're high on the trait of openness and you're really curious and all of this, being open to new experiences, being open to new views on doing things, different approaches can be quite an intrinsic value. But I think what's really curious is one of the founders of personality assessments, a guy called Allport, has one of my favorite quotes in the 20th century. Says, if I want to know something about somebody, I ask them. So when I'm working with a client, my first question would be, how would you describe your personality? So we work with a self-narrative. Then you ask them, what are the key values? You can ask, like, what are the key values that are important to you? What you wouldn't compromise on? Like, for example, we know if you're high on agreeableness, you're less likely to compromise on more kind of ethical things, especially if you're high on conscientiousness. There are things that are right and the things that are wrong. Recently, I read a study which was fascinating about promotion and personality. And in corporates, it seemed people lower in agreeableness are more likely to get promoted. So does this imply that people more with, let's say, flexible ethics are more likely to be promoted within organizations? And what are the implications of that? So,
It
but
seems
yeah,
it seems, and even what you say there, this idea of flexible ethics, agreeableness, you're equating with a flexibility of ethics as opposed to flexibility to deal with different personalities, for example.
yes, it could be both. Like the thing is with high agreeableness, people have this more things of like what's fair, what's potentially a little bit more inclined to look at that. People with low agreeableness might not care that much about it. They might still have that value even with a different personality, but it's just what research shows is that especially if you're high on agreeableness and conscientiousness, there's this more kind of right and wrong. While how can I put it, within corporates, sometimes if you compromise on your values, you're rewarded for it.
Right. You do talk a fair amount about this notion of success versus and effectiveness, and there's a sort of a bifurcation in there. When you are looking at personality, uh, we can talk about it in the context of business and such, but what is it about, or how much of personality can help you to have a more fulfilling life? What are the levers within personality that we should be looking at if being more fulfilled is important to you, as opposed to just being happy?
Absolutely. So I think what's really key here is that how can you tell an article about well-being is written with somebody with a psychology background rather than not? And that is when it's written with somebody with psychology background, they put down subjective well-being because ultimately all well-being is subjective. And I think that happiness and fulfillment as well. It's a very individual's journey. What's good for you might not be what's good for somebody else. And I think having this self-awareness and understanding of your personality is very key because humans are highly flexible. Quite often when people get a psychometric report, they go, can you answer me one question? I go, what? Is this my home self or my work self?
Mm.
So people manage their personality to that extent that they have several personas, and that's okay because we're different people. We're different, behaving differently with different people, situations. We're different with our parents, with our partner, with our colleagues, and it's great. It's great to have that flexibility. People who don't have this flexibility are often described as strong personalities. So, but what's really important here is that we are aware what gives us energy. So to me, if you have a strong preference on what you like from personality, it's like an essential vitamin. So let's say if you're highly creative by nature, but you don't have any opportunity to create, you're not getting that essential vitamin. If you need time for yourself to recharge, but you don't have that time for yourself, you don't have that essential vitamin. If you need to socialize with lots of people, but you don't have time to socialize, you're not getting this essential vitamin. So let's say if you don't get that essential vitamin, over time you will develop an emotional version of scurvy. So because you're not getting that sustenance, and you can put up with it, but if you put up with it for long enough, a part of you might die inside.
This feels like circling back to the premise you talked about in the beginning, which is the presentation, the avatar of yourself. You have the presentation of you as a friend, you have the presentation of you at work, you have the presentation of yourself online, which is sort of
Yes.
maybe a little bit of a merger. And you just talked about scurvy. I I feel that there's a lot of fatigue out there in general. There's a lot of loneliness out there in general, and burnout. And when you are constantly trying to be different people, the energy, that vitamin that you're talking about, is very likely to be hard, a little bit rare.
Absolutely, because you're not only necessarily getting the vitamin, but you might be doing the opposite of what you want to do. So let's say if you're highly creative but need to be detail focused. So not only you're not getting the vitamin of creativity, you might be dialing up the opposite in order to be detail focused. If you're somebody who wanted to be creative, but working as an accountant, that might be really soul destroying to that individual, unless they become a creative accountant, but that's not necessarily a good thing, so to say. But it's quite often that people would compensate with things outside of work with less healthier compensation strategies than others. And I think we play now so many roles, especially on social media. Like your personality can be tracked back from the language you use on social media. So, and I find it fascinating. Like, for example, uh, out of the big five, so neuroticism, extroversion, openness, agreeableness, conscientiousness model, there's a recent studies that looked at LinkedIn, and we can track back your four traits, but one trait you cannot track on LinkedIn. Which trait you think people choose not to show on LinkedIn?
Neuroticism.
Exactly. So people don't bring neuroticism to LinkedIn because it's all about being professional, that lovely word, being professional. How much
Perfect.
individual differences died under it? How much individuality is left behind? And it's fascinating. It's like we play different roles and it's exhausting. And as Kurt Vonnegut said, one of my favorite quotes, we are what we pretend to be. So be really careful what you pretend to be. And if you pretend all of this stuff, other people don't see the real you. They interpret your behaviors. So if you're behaving in an opposite way to who you are, that's how people see you. So I sometimes get people who are highly introverted, in order to succeed in an extroverted cultured organization, they dial up the extroversion. It's exhausting. And then at 5 o'clock, their extroverted colleagues go, "You want to go for a drink?" And they go, "Can't you just imagine how tired I am by the end of the day? Why are they asking me?" And I go, "But what if they think you're an extrovert? They might think you enjoy that." And they go, "Oh, I didn't think that." It's like
It
if
does.
you're not acting who you are, how you expect anybody to see you for who you are?
So what's the key to actually knowing who you are, Nikita? Because in the end of the day, if it's so hard it's already very fluid, just by myself of me, as opposed to these other psychometrics and other people's evaluations of me. How do you sort of end up with something that you are aware of and that you can lean into? I mean, presumably including some sides of you that aren't so good.
Well, the thing is that to me, personality is a liminal construct. It exists between two states: is who we think we were and who we are becoming. So the way we define personality in our book is yourself developing yourself, because it's always changing, because that self-narrative is based on your perception of the past. Our memory is not perfect, all of that, but we'll get into memory. And ultimately, we change by the circumstances we're in. And ultimately, we're on that trajectory of becoming either by the life events, as you mentioned, but also by what's happening to us and maybe something in our genetics. And there's lots and lots of variables. So we're always in this state of flux. So to me, it's about realizing that we're in a state of flux and updating who we think we are and being open to it. Like we're update software on our devices all the time. But how often do we update who we think we are? Because, people go, "I'm a Virgo, I'm an extrovert, I'm empathetic, I'm emotionally intelligent." But How often do you check in with yourself and others around you? How have you changed? How have you developed? And also challenging your assumptions while you're managing your personality. So in my sessions with clients, I love the question is like, unless the person says, is this my home self or my work self? In that case, I ask, how is it two different? But if a person doesn't bring this up, ask him what aspects of your personality do you consciously manage at work and why? And over thousands of sessions, everybody has an answer. So, and sometimes it's like, I need to be less emotional at work. And you're dealing with somebody in their 40s or 50s, senior executive in the corporate. And you say, why? And go, because my first manager said I should be less emotional. Like, when did this happen? Oh, when I was 20, working in a neighborhood shop in my first job. Okay, so this person for the last 30 years, plus potentially, has been managing their personality every day at work based on one sentence feedback they got from somebody 30 years ago in a different job, in a different context. So this person might be already less emotional and highly likely to be less emotionally dynamic because they're less likely to be neurotic because it goes down with age to an extent. And maybe they've seek therapy, which reduces your neuroticism and further, and all of this, but they still manage about themselves. Or, I cannot be as strategic as I want. Well, why not? Because people told me to keep my ideas to myself. It was 20 years ago. You're now on a C-suite of a company. If you're not going to try to explore your ideas here, when will you? And people carry this with them all this time. So I think that being a little bit more playful and a little bit less serious with your self-construct. And when people tell you about stuff you disagree with, that's not me. Well, actually, how about asking that person when was the last time they've seen this? Because it becomes so much more interesting to explore this. And rather than sitting with your non-updated construct, working on feedback you got 30 years ago, instead of actually exploring this and seeing, well, how have I changed? Turn to your spouse or a partner or a good friend over a pint and say, look, over the years we've known each other, any change you noticed? Just curious, I'm just reflecting. And
Oh,
they have you don't need to agree with them, but it might be really interesting to find out. And we don't have that chats because we work on assumptions. And
mm,
rather than actually being kind of curious with this about ourselves and others, it's like I find it so fascinating in the workplace that people rather go to Google rather than their colleagues. It's like instead of asking their colleague, "Hey, Becky, great you joined the team. I'm just kind of curious. How would you like to receive feedback?" They're much more likely to go, "How to give feedback to your colleagues on
mm,
Google," instead of actually asking your colleague how they like their feedback. Or Becky, how would you describe yourself? How do you like to work? You know, what really stresses you out? How can we see you're stressed? How we can help? Asking open, explorative, curious questions about your colleagues and friends can be so interesting, especially now on Teams and remote work. Because how much do you know your colleagues as individuals? Because let's say back in the office, I'm not saying everybody should go back to the office, but let's say in an office environment, if a meeting finishes early, you might catch up for a cup of tea. You might bump into each other in the corridor. If you don't have like a clean desk policy, you can see your colleague's desk with the pictures of their family. I once saw a guy who literally has a sock framed on his table, and I was like, "What is this?" And it was a charity bike race. So that individuality is coming through. What happens now if you finish a Teams meeting 15 minutes early? I'll give you 15 minutes of your life back. And you go, "Great, I can use the bathroom." Uh, uh, you know, Nobody canceled hierarchy of needs by Maslow. The key thing is that how often do you get to know them outside of work? And humans are fantastic at making very hardcore assumptions with no data. So we can assume like, oh, this person's like this. Oh, they're poker faced and they're cross-armed. And I watched a YouTube video that if they're cross-armed, they don't like you with body language. It's like, what? No, they're just cross-armed and they're introverted and they're listening. Oh, that person has a camera off. They don't like me enough. We just make all these assumptions. It's like one of my colleagues, and when he's working in a one-to-one session with a client, and the client has a very strong opinion about somebody, like, oh, they're just like this or just like that. He goes, fascinating. So what was the exact question you asked them to let you know this? And yeah, it's just an
They
assumption.
they spin off. I
Yeah.
wanted to ask you a question that I have been ruminating with personally. So talk about assumptions and fact check, or at least put it against your body of work and understanding. It is, we've been talking about this gap between who I am and who I really, or what I present, maybe the work life, the personal life, and mental health issues. Two of the maladies we talk about are schizophrenia and bipolar. And it feels to me that there's a link between this inability or inconsistency with who I am and who I present myself as. Is there, in fact, a link? And second question, is there any evidence to say there's more of schizophrenia and bipolar in today's world because of the multiple ways we present ourselves?
That's a fascinating question. I'm not familiar with any research, and neither am I a clinical psychologist, but I can put you in touch with people who work with schizophrenia, and they can maybe answer that question. To me, I don't work with clinical cases, but I think there's more, from my side, it's more about personality, and I think there's more fragmentation.
Hmm.
That's how I would see it. There's
Yeah,
so many roles now we play, because now we play digital roles as well.
right.
So we
Exactly. The
haven't played,
avatar.
yeah, there's more avatars, there's more facades. Like, not only now you don't bring your neuroticism to work, you also don't bring it to LinkedIn. But
And the way you present yourself on Facebook will be different from Twitter, will be different from LinkedIn, will be different from Insta.
exactly. And how you present yourself, because we always, as previously mentioned, play different roles with our parents, colleagues, friends. Now we have all this digital stuff. Then we have this presentation, this avatars, this personal brand. I mean, Jesus, I just really don't like it. Like, part of me just shatters when people talk about personal branding. And, you know, build your brand, and then people don't see you for who you are, and then that contributed potentially to loss of connection.
Well, it is sort of an ever-ending question, the idea of persona, right? The mask and personality. I
Mm.
want to get, before we finish, there are two other areas I wanted to go into. And one of them was related to sense of humor. What is the relationship with personality and sense of humor? Is there a some sort of correlation that we should be looking at? And how much is sense of humor a part of your gestalt and sense of enjoyment of life?
That's really interesting, because the only research I read were super high neuroticism is correlated with super high performance. Why their average to high is correlated with high levels of performance is stand-up comedy.
Hmm.
So stand-up comedians, which tend to be fantastic, tend to be super neurotic.
Hmm.
And so I think humor is one of the coping mechanisms. Um, and I think humor is one of the more healthier ways to discharge neuroticism, to untrigger it. Because quite often, one of the pillars of neuroticism is a negative self-construct. So people high on neuroticism have a more negative attitude towards themselves. Therefore, when they get a performance review, because of confirmation bias, which is not only for Google, they immediately look at the development areas. They don't necessarily even read the positives. And if they read them, they forget half of them within 3 days and all of them within 7 days, because they have so much work to do on themselves. And that previous American study of people wanting to be less neurotic, and I think this is how one of the things neuroticism gets you. If we're neurotic about it, so we want to change this. So we become neurotic about being neurotic, and it's a feedback loop. So you become like negative self-construct is reinforced because this is something you want to change. And I think presenting a little bit of humor about it is healthier. Like, be it high anxiety, sometimes anger, frustration, all of this. Sometimes I think just kind of how people make light of it can be much more productive than thinking, how can I change this? Rather than how it served me well, where the humor comes in. And I think humor, to a large extent, is a way to deal with neuroticism. A colleague of mine, Nicholas, he works in human factors. He recently published a book, not a book, an article called Humor Factors. And it's how humor can be used to diffuse really high tense situations. And he worked in aviation. And one of my favorite examples was a case where a plane was misbehaving, like not doing what pilot said, and it's dropping thousands of feet, going thousands of feet. Everybody survived, so captain and first officer were interviewed, and the captain. And in aviation, one of the main source of memes is the film Airplane.
Hmm.
And so
I got your Vector.
yeah, exactly. Roger, Roger. And he noticed that his first officer was freaking out. And the captain realized, like, I needed to discharge the situation because, like, the first officer is freaking out is not going to help the situation. So once the plane stabilized a little bit, he turns to the first officer. He goes, I picked the wrong day to stop sniffing glue. So, and that kind of helped to discharge it a little bit. And you see also a similar example of Chris Hadfield in his book Astronaut's Guide to Earth, to sometimes use humor to kind of discharge the situation. I think humor is a fantastic way to deal with neuroticism.
So it makes me want to just do a little deviation in the notion of having a backbone versus being agreeable and open. When you are giving a joke, there is some kind of, you are really presenting something about you because you presumably think it's funny. So
Yeah,
it's almost like a window into me. If I think this joke, Vector, Airplane's the funniest movie ever, everybody has to see it. It's putting myself on the line a little bit. To what extent do you believe it's important to have a backbone, a rigid element of yourself, versus this idea of flexibility, adaptableness, openness?
I think everybody has a backbone and everybody's flexible. The question is to what extent. Some people have different ranges. And that's where mixed things like values, boundaries, all of this comes into play. And I think with humor, absolutely, you're putting yourself out there. I do stand-up comedy as well. And it's really fascinating how to work with the audience. And I think if you facilitate it a little bit and get a sense of the audience first and get their participation, it becomes a little bit easier because you can adapt to it. Like I try to do stand-up comedy online, and it's just so infinitely more difficult
Yeah, because you had
because you
no
can't,
feedback.
yeah, you can't read the room. Like to me, if I don't have the cameras on, all of this, I rather go to the dentist. I really do. But it's just it's you putting yourself out there, and at the same time become very sensitive to reading the room of how the audience responds. And I think with humor, it is one of the. I'm actually going to look into research after our chat about humor and correlations with personality, because there should be some, maybe people high on openness like more abstract humor, or it'd be interesting what sort of comedy shows people watch, and also which comedy shows have particular cult following, and how is that correlated with particular personality traits.
Which brings back this idea of the backbone, because a cult following suggests it's a specific type of humor, not for everybody. And you mentioned this idea of reading the room when you talked about the great skills or leadership qualities. One of them is the ability to communicate, and it feels like an end personality. And so reading the room would feel like a great leadership skill.
Absolutely, I'd say reading the room, and I'd add listening. With the trait which is most missing in leadership, well, one of the traits in my experience is listening, because there's a reason for it. So if you take extroversion, introversion, and in the middle there's ambiversion, if you have both, um, extroverts want leadership more. They have more of an appetite for power, and maybe it comes down to values, etc., as well. But they just want it more, so they end up more in positions of power. Just statistically, there's no correlation with performance, though. So introverts, extroverts, ambiverts can all make great leaders. It's just extroverts want it more, so they probably statistically end up in positions of power more. And therefore, I often have, whenever read LinkedIn articles saying like 5 things that take no effort, and one of them is listening. And I go, not if you're a bloody extrovert. It takes so much effort to shut up sometimes. Because listening takes effort. You might think you're super empathetic, but if you don't listen, what are you empathizing with? And I suggest that, and often I'd have like people who come into me, to me, and have like a little chat. Say, look, I have this team. They never speak up. Can you do a workshop to help them speak up? Okay, can I attend one of your meetings first? And attend one of the meetings, and after the sessions, like, what are you thinking of a workshop? We could do a workshop, and you could pay me some money, or maybe next time, just give people space to speak, because you just spoke at them for an hour. It was impressive, but there was no time for any of them to speak up. Neither was there any invitation to. But I wanted to brainstorm and all of this again. But if you're highly extroverted and you speak in a way which other people interpret as more confident, that you already made this decision, it's not an invitation to play with ideas. People are more likely to see, oh, he's decided, or she's decided, or they decided, and therefore it's just like, okay, my view is not welcome here. Participation is optional. I go, just next time you say any questions, count to 15 inside your head, because your default setting is any questions, good, moving on. Because in your case, when you have a question, you already stopped listening, and you just wait for that point when somebody says any, and you immediately jump in there, and you expect everybody else to do the same. So just give people a bit of space. And I think this is where the most interesting thing about personality comes in. To me, in my experience, the best return on investment is when people focus on their lowest trait, what they avoid the most. So if you avoid detail the most, being a little bit more detail orientated can be more beneficial. But no, it takes energy. So schedule it in the morning, not Friday evening, that you might avoid it and push it back. But also, before you do this, look around your team, because if there's one thing I'd like to communicate to people about personality, and I blame the personal development industry, is that it tells you all the things you need to be as a leader. And it changes every 2 years. Like, you need to be more tough. You need to be more vulnerable. Vulnerable, it implies there's a threat. Maybe we should deal with the threat first. But anyways, that's a different topic. But you need to be more creative. You need to be more pragmatic. You need to be more introvert. You need to be more extrovert. You don't need to be all of those things, because you can try this, but there'll be fragmentation and exhaustion. What you can do is that look around your team and who you can delegate this to, because our personalities don't exist in isolation. We're social creatures. We're designed that way. When people say, oh, we met and we just clicked. Well, what did click exactly? Or we met and we had great chemistry. Well, what was the reactive substances? And I suggest it's personality, to an extent, part of it. And I think that this is what's really key, is how you can facilitate collective intelligence around you. So if you present with your fantastic ideas, but people don't buy the best ideas, they buy ideas they can understand. And you have a colleague who keeps asking you all the annoying nitpicky questions and mixing with your flow. How about next time, the day before you buy this person a coffee, say, look, I really appreciate your attention to detail or cautiousness, etc. Can we just run through the slides, and can you tell me if anything's missing? And so I might go between slide 2 and 3, this is missing. And I think over time we develop these symbiotic relationships. Because let's say if you're highly creative and highly imaginative and highly innovative, in order to pay your taxes and exist in this society of ours, you still need to have this pragmatism, attention to detail. But what if you pair up with somebody who has a great attention to detail and not so much of that innovation side? So they can look after implementation to the full extent. And when they need a bit of innovation, they turn to you. So you can be full out on innovation. It can be full out implementation. And you rely on each other for this, because you don't need to compromise. But the way to achieve this is to rely on each other, because we need each other.
To know who you are, what your weaknesses are, and then get a complementary type of person. And I wanted to add into the listening thing, obviously a topic near to my heart, is this notion of non-judgmental listening, because frowning as someone speaking is to, even if you don't mean to be frowning, it will make the other person typically think, already questioning what I'm saying. But these are skills. I wanted to last question. Time is running out, but I have to ask it, which is the notion of charisma. And let's say that from all the people I've ever known who were in major leadership positions, or, for example, presidents of countries, it seems that one of their tying factors is that they have charisma, which is identified as making me feel, or the person they're speaking to, the center of their universe, despite their position. What is the relationship between charisma and personality, Nikita?
And that's a fascinating topic, but making you feel like a center of attention, it is an interesting talent that some people have. It's like people will forget what you did for them, but they'll never forget how you made them feel. And I
Right.
think this is where it's really important that we
Angelo.
take that people want to be seen as individuals they are. We have this fundamental need. And I think this is where we come to nice tie-up of a few topics discussed today, is that charisma, as you described charisma, people just want to be seen. But if people don't show who they really are, what are we being seen for? Even asking your client what you would like to be seen for, what you would like to be recognized for, is something that something can be really valuable. Like, I'm not sure I'm that charismatic, but what I like to do in workshops, so I like to put people into groups when the work is in tag teams, and with focus on each of the individuals, the others provide feedback on what they appreciate this person brings to the team, and just to have that moment of being seen. I think it's really key, and I think this is definitely something we can take out of charismatic people's books. And what can we do? Because it's charisma is often said, oh, he's charismatic, or she's charismatic, or they are charismatic. Great, but actually how you defined it, it's not about them. It's how they make you feel, and to make you feel seen. And I think that if we take this a little bit more into our everyday life, where we show a little bit more of ourselves to others, and when people show a little bit more of themselves, we make them feel seen for it, I think makes life a little bit more bearable, rather than being obsessed with likes on LinkedIn, to posts of how smart you think you are, because I don't think this gives us essential vitamins. But being seen for who we are, being who we are, and developing and changing and playing to each other's strengths and all that good stuff is far more sustainable than obsessing about infinite avatars we can create today and infinite possibilities. Because right now, for example, one of the things, I was chatting with a colleague recently, she's a therapist, is how dating apps change their perception of relationships. Because one of the first times, like when your personality goes through a big change, is when you enter your first relationship. But right now, we might not feel need to change and grow through our relationships, because there's infinite possibilities. Because let me just download an app, and I'll have millions of potential partners. Surely I can find somebody better than that. And then the question, do we change? Do we grow through our experiences? Or do we exist in the possibilities and actually never develop and grow? I'm not saying we should stay in unhappy relationships, of course not. There is that kind of, what are we losing right now by not using experiences to develop, but just leaving? Because ultimately, if you go, I didn't like this partner, and this partner, and this partner, and this, because of this, and this, how many do you need until you realize what the common denominator is, which is you? And therefore, I think what this digital world right now offers is infinite possibility, and to what extent is now might be preventing us from development, because we have endless escapism. That's what I would be interesting to explore.
It feels like we could have had a infinite conversation, Nikita, but there are things as limits, and putting some limits on life is probably a good thing, including the fact that we all have to meet our maker at the end, and that is the ultimate limit. So this idea of infinite non-boundary, non-constrained boundaries is something that we can discuss maybe over a beer next time. Nikita, I'm showing your book, Personality, a User's Guide, co-written with Georgi Yankov and yourself, published by Robinson. How can people get your book? How can they get in touch with you if they're interested in hiring you to bring you in, talk to them about improving their personalities and business culture?
Well, the book is available through Waterstones, Amazon, and Blackwell's, and lots of other, even eBay, etc. So you can definitely get your hands on either the physical or the digital ebook. And then what else? As far as connecting with me, the only social media I use is LinkedIn. So just connect with me, Nikita Mikhailov, Chief Neuroticism Officer. I'm the only neuroticism officer on there. Lots of happiness officers running about. So I thought I'd fly the flag for negative emotional affect. And always happy to connect and geek out.
Nikita, you are a model neurotic and beautiful. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here and having a chat. Hopefully we can catch out for that beer afterwards.
Look for it.